There is an almost, I think, universal agreement that strength is good and that weakness is bad, or at least less good. At the same time, we also know there are different kinds of strength, right? There's physical strength, there's mental strength, there's emotional strength, there's moral strength. And that means what it looks like to exercise strength looks different in different contexts. And so sport or work or study or relationships. But we know strength when we see it, don't we? And we know the difference that it makes. You know, the inspiring ability of a powerful athlete. The inspiration of a capable student. The blessing of a resilient worker. And by contrast, that means we know what weakness is when we see it, don't we? And we know the difference it makes. And it's in this sense that I think we all rightly desire to be strong in whatever way we need to be strong. And as Mike said, we are in the fourth and final installment of our mini-series in Romans 12 to 14, unpacking the implications of being people in the grip of grace. What does it look like in our lives, that reality? And in chapter 14, and actually into chapter 15, which we won't look at, Paul deals with a specific issue going on in the life of the Roman church. And it's an issue that raises the question, what does it mean to be strong in faith? What does it mean to be strong in faith? Does it mean having spiritual power, being spiritually capable, spiritually resilient? Does being weak in faith mean the opposite of all those things? Or does it mean something different altogether? And what difference does it make to the way that we relate to others, especially fellow believers, other Christians? And in addressing these questions, the first thing that Paul says we have to understand is that we have liberty. We have liberty. And so verse 1, accept anyone who is weak in faith, but don't argue about doubtful issues. So off the bat here, we've got these two groups, the weak and the strong. As you may see, the strong actually isn't mentioned explicitly. It's just implied in contrast to the weak. It's not actually until chapter 15, verse 1 that Paul explicitly talks about the strong, and he includes himself in that category when he does that. And these categories of weak and strong, you can see there, they're connected to this idea of doubtful issues. What's that about? Well, other translations help us. So the NIV calls them disputable matters. The ESV just calls them opinions. Opinions. So basically, these are non-essential issues in the Christian life. They're grey areas, areas in which the Bible doesn't spell out clear guidelines, spiritually or morally. And crucially, I think, they are issues that are not key to saving faith. This is not about our salvation. And for the Roman Christians, these doubtful issues, well, you know, they involved the eating of only some food and the observing of certain days as special. So, verse 2, one person believes he may eat anything, but one who is weak eats only vegetables. And verse 5, one person considers one day to be above another, someone else considers every day to be the same. Now, the first thing that has to be said, this is not about vegetarianism whatsoever. It's not talking about that. The reference later in the passage in verse 14 to clean and to unclean, it strongly suggests to us the Jewish law. And that makes perfect sense in the context. Remember where we were last week, flowing into this bit, that is what Paul is talking about when he talks about these foods and observing special days. And so in the Roman church, the weak are those believers who are more Jewish, and the strong are those believers who are more Gentile, more non-Jewish. And we can see that by the issues that Paul mentions here, that by weak in faith, Paul doesn't mean someone who only trusts Jesus a little bit. That's not what he's talking about. In fact, that's not really even a thing. You can't only trust Jesus a little bit. You either trust Jesus or you don't. That's not what he's talking about here. This isn't a question of faith itself. What this is a question of how we express our faith, how we express it. These Christians are weak in the sense that they can only express their faith in one particular way. in this case, a Jewish way. So what this is actually about, what this is fundamentally about is Christian liberty, Christian freedom. See, liberty is the great gift of grace, isn't it? Liberty is the precious byproduct of God's mercies to us in Jesus. Freedom. As people in the grip of grace, we're free. We're free from the consequences of sin and death. God's judgment has been spared. Our right standing before God is assured, as is our future in his eternal daylight, as we saw last week, his eternal kingdom. And in our lives now, that means we're also free. We're free from the power of sin. We're free from religion. From the burden of having to try to be right with God by our own efforts. And we're free from certain outward requirements to express our faith in particular ways. The sort of requirements expressed in the Jewish food laws and the Jewish worship laws. The strong Christian understands this precious freedom, this precious liberty, and they embrace it fully, is what Paul is saying. But the weak Christian doesn't. What is this like? Well, imagine two different Penrith supporters. Both agree that the essential part of being a supporter is the team itself, the mighty Panthers, right? That's who you commit to cheering on to the exclusion of all others. That is the key non-negotiable to being a Penrith Panthers supporter. One supporter, let's call them the weak supporter, feels they can only express support for the Panthers by being a season ticket holder. And when they turn up to every game, having to wear the Penrith Panthers jersey in all the colours, knowing all the words of the team song, that's what one supporter feels. It just doesn't feel like support otherwise. But the other supporter, let's call him or her the strong supporter, they understand that they have freedom in the way they express their support for the mighty Panthers. And so they could go to every game, or they can just go to the games that they can make. The rest they'll watch on TV. And when they go to games, they can wear the strip and they can wear all the colours, or they can just wear what's comfortable. These are the disputable matters, the doubtful issues of being a footy supporter. And see, the support itself doesn't change, just the expression of that support. There's liberty there. And Paul himself fully embraced his Christian liberty. He conformed to the Jewish way of life when he was in Jewish society, and he equally was, agreeable and accommodated himself to non-Jewish ways of life when he was with Gentiles, when he was with non-Jews. But not every Christian back in Paul's time and through to today embraces their liberty in the same way. And this issue had caused disunity in the Roman church. It had caused them to become partisan, to take sides, and to be critical of one another. And you might have seen the word criticism and that throughout the passage as Steve read it. This isn't just about mere disagreements. This is like capital C criticism. As the NIV puts it, condemnation. And so Paul, primarily speaking to the strong, and that I think is the main focus of it, but primarily speaking to the strong, he says in verse 3 that the one who eats, the one who is strong in faith, they must not look down on the one who does not eat. So in their context, the more Gentile Christians are not to look down on the more Jewish Christians. That is, they're not to be dismissive and arrogant, that they alone know right. But also, he doesn't stop there, does he? This cuts both ways. So the one who doesn't eat mustn't criticise the one who does, judgmentally, condemning them. Why not? Because God has accepted him. God has accepted them both. There's liberty both ways. There is liberty either way. This is so important. This is so important for us because it's clear here, isn't it, that Paul has an ideal. It's that everyone will be strong as he was. That's his ideal. That comes through quite clearly. The very use of the term weak suggests that there is an ideal, right? And yet, what comes through equally as strong, if not stronger? That it is not our place to criticise or condemn our fellow believers. in Jesus, God has accepted the weak and the strong equally. Verse 9. And so both can exist. Both should coexist in the same fellowship of believers. This is why Jesus died and rose again, to be Lord of all. We're not lords of one another. We are all under the one Lord, Jesus. And so we can't condemn one another over these doubtful issues. And also we can't do that because, verse 10 to 12, we ourselves will be judged. We will all stand before the tribunal of God. And yes, God's judgment for our sin has been paid for in Jesus, but God will judge our works. What will our account be before the ultimate judge? What will yours be? What will mine be? That you lauded your liberty over the more tender consciences of your fellow believers in the name of being right, in your opinion? That you always criticised your freer brothers and sisters in the name of some apparent greater devotion to God? Martin Luther, the great reformer, he summed it up like this. A Christian person is a most free Lord of all, subject to none. Liberty. A most free Lord of all, subject to none. That's who we are. Of course, thinking about how we apply this passage, right, gets a little bit trickier, doesn't it, for us today? Some people say that this liberty applies to anything that Christians disagree over. It doesn't. That is not the case. It doesn't apply to issues where the Bible spells out clear guidelines, spiritually or morally. It doesn't apply to issues that are key to saving faith, the reality of our sin, Jesus' death and resurrection in our place. What this is about is expressing your faith through a set of cultural practices and the weakness of that being the only way that you express your faith. I think the recent issue of COVID vaccination has become one relevant example. You know, for some there are conscience issues around both the development of vaccines and the taking of them, especially by way of government or workplace mandate. For others, embracing vaccination, it shows appropriate obedience to the state, as we thought about a couple of weeks ago. And it's a necessary act of love for our neighbour, as we considered last week. But either way, this is something that we may disagree on as a community of believers, but this is not something that we can despise one another for. We may disagree over it, but we cannot despise one another for. We cannot condemn one another. The person who wholeheartedly embraces vaccination and the person who doesn't are both equally accepted by God because of their faith in Jesus. And so they need to be equally accepted by one another. I think more generally, there are other relevant examples for us, aren't there? Cultural church practices, the music that we sing. Do we just sing hymns? Do we just use the organ? Or none? Just the instruments mentioned in the Psalms? What's the place of communion and how we do that? What about holy days or holy periods like Lent or even Sabbath? Drinking alcohol, which is actually mentioned in this passage, isn't it, in verse 21. Gambling of any sort, smoking, watching certain movies or TV shows, listening to certain forms of music, holding certain political views. How do we understand all these things in light of Romans 14? We understand that our liberty is precious. It allows us to express our faith in a variety of ways. We should embrace that. But because we all have liberty, not just some of us, because we all have liberty, because we all have freedom, we should extend that to all. And that means we don't prioritise our liberty. We prioritise our love. We prioritise our love. Verse 13. Therefore, let us no longer criticise one another. Instead, decide never to put a stumbling block or pitfall in your brother's way. For if your brother is hurt by what you eat, you are no longer walking in love. Do not destroy that one that Christ died for by what you eat. Putting a stumbling block or a pitfall before a Christian brother or sister, it means that we make their Christian walk, just their Christian lives, more difficult. I mean, so unloving is the insistence of doing this. So in the case of the Roman Christians, maybe the Gentile believers, more Gentile believers saying, I'm going to eat all kinds of meat. So unloving is this insistence that it may actually cause a fellow believer to stumble or fall in some way in their faith. That is the opposite of getting stronger in your faith, isn't it? It's going backwards. Maybe it actually leads them to sin in some way. Or maybe it causes them to join us against their better judgment, only to be tormented by that choice, as verses 22 and 23 kind of reflect. A former college lecturer of mine, Peter Orr, he tells a story of a man converted out of a Muslim background. And the missionaries who were part of that wonderful experience, they insisted immediately that he start eating pork. Immediately. As you know, Muslims are forbidden from eating pork. And it caused this man a great deal of unnecessary guilt and doubt around his newfound Christian identity. They didn't give him time to work through these things. Or they didn't give him the freedom to say, hey, look, because of your cultural background and where you've come from, you can express your faith by not eating pork. That's okay. Do not destroy the one that Christ died for by what you eat. Instead, verse 19, we must pursue what promotes peace and what builds up one another. Do not tear down God's work because of food. Notice the contrast here. We should pursue what builds up and we should avoid what tears down. It can't be more stark, can it? God is in the business of building up his people, building up those who are in his grip of grace. And a great deal of that he does in and through his people, the church. But sadly, if God's work can be built up in and through the church, it can also be torn down in and through the church by God's people. On the level of individuals, which has been a lot of the focus up to this point, person to person, but also the church itself. As happened in Rome, it can cause community-wide disunity, can lead to what's called breaking fellowship. That is, refusing to remain in community together. And according to Romans 14, breaking fellowship over these doubtful issues is an act of tearing down God's work. And that's happened here at Minchinbury. That's happened. Patrick Henry, one of the American revolutionaries back in the 18th century, famously in a speech rousing the colonies to fight off Great Britain for independence, he famously declared, "Give me liberty or give me death." That is, liberty at all costs, freedom at all costs. Now, given the context, that was an appropriate attitude. But I wonder, is that how you perhaps feel about your liberties as a Christian? Give me liberty or give me death. My liberties at all costs. Please let it not be, Paul says. Please let it not be. That is not who you are. Instead, pursue what? Godly peace. Instead, prioritize Christian love, because that's who you are. That's who we are. Remember last week, we're people of light and we're people of love. We saw that last week. We saw that in chapter 12. And so what does Paul say in verse 21? He says, it's actually a noble thing to miss out. It's noble. It's godly to miss out, to limit yourself. And this is made crystal clear by what Paul goes on to say in chapter 15, which we won't look at all, but he points to the example of Christ. He points to the example of Christ, who, though God himself, gave up all things for our good. What more motivation do you need? What greater example do you need as servants of that most gracious and most loving Lord? How can we possibly treat one another any differently? And so Martin Luther's summary that we looked at earlier, right? A Christian man is a most free Lord of all, subject to none. Well, being a wise man, in the very next sentence he goes on to say, a Christian person is a most dutiful servant of all, subject to all. A Christian person is a most free Lord of all, subject to none. At the same time, a Christian person is a most dutiful servant of all, subject to all. See, the strong don't exercise their liberty. The strong exercise their love. The strong Christian limits his or her precious liberty out of priceless love for his or her brother and sister in Christ. Our liberty is precious, but our love is priceless. Our liberty is precious, but our love is priceless. How can we do this? How can we live this out? How can we do this? How can we be servants of all here at Minchinbury? What priceless, noble acts of liberty-limiting love can we pursue here? Again, there are many we could entertain and think about. We don't have time for them all. I want to reflect on just one. I want to choose just one which we do as a church, one which we're about to do in a few moments' time. It's how we do communion here. As most of you know, we use grape juice instead of wine. Now, most people here at Minchinbury have no problem with wine or with alcohol. Some would even prefer it as part of communion. A member of my discipleship group just this week, as we were talking about this, said how one of the things he does like about actually using wine in communion is that the lingering aftertaste just helps him reflect that bit longer on what it represents. It's true, it's got that effect. That's all good stuff, right? But imagine being an alcoholic, recovering or otherwise. Imagine the stumbling block that a forced cup of wine once a month might be, no matter how small that little plastic cup might be. It might lead to further struggle and further suffering in that area. It might lead that person to have to decide that they can't participate in communion. Now, we don't necessarily know if there's anyone here, week by week, month by month, who has that issue. But still, we use grape juice. Still, we limit our freedom to use wine in order to avoid putting that stumbling block, even inadvertently. And I'll encourage you to reflect on the ways in which in your own personal lives you might find yourself with that same opportunity. Why? Because a strong Christian limits his or her precious liberty out of priceless love for their brother and sister in Christ. This is what it means. This is the rubber hitting the road of people in the grip of grace. We've been shown grace, let's extend it to one another and beyond. We're transformed. We've been renewed. We're being transformed. We're being renewed. What's the take home? Our liberty is precious, but our love is priceless. Amen.